Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of my look at Eastory's World War II, the Western Front. If you didn't see part 1 of my reaction, the link is in the description, as well as the link to this original content. Definitely check him out. I heard a lot of really positive feedback from you guys who maybe weren't already familiar with Eastory's work, and you might recognize it as well, that he does the maps for the World War II week-by-week channel that Indy Nydell is a part of. I'm still, as you can probably hear, recovering from a pretty nasty cold that I've been dealing with for almost a week now. So I haven't been making videos for my gaming channel, but I'm getting back to that today. So just bear with me if I sound a little sick or my voice sounds a little off. That's why. And as always, thank you guys so much for your support, and I hope you guys have an incredible holiday season. Let's dive into part 2.
In the second part of 1944, Germany had suffered its worst defeat yet. The Soviet forces had advanced up to the German border. In the west, the Allies had landed in France and moved up to the German frontiers. The Red Army and the Allies were preparing to launch a final offensive into Germany in early 1945.
And so at this point, I mean, it's pretty apparent to everyone that Germany's not going to win the war. I think even the more level-headed folks in Germany understand this, and so they're already starting to think about what happens post-war. The Allies are thinking this, the Germans are thinking this. For the Germans, what they're thinking is our best bet for a reasonable, favorable settlement is with the Western Allies. If we let the Soviets have their way, it's going to be ugly, it's going to be brutal, it's going to be reprisals and revenge. At least we can hope for fair treatment from the Brits, the Canadians, the French, the Americans. So they're thinking that way. The Western Allies are thinking the same thing. This is all about who's going to influence and control the post-war world. They're already thinking about the clash to come between them and communism, capitalism versus communism. So all of this is being thought of even while the war isn't even won yet.
The Western Allies planned to carry out smaller attacks before the offensive. Their goal was to break through the German defenses of the Siegfried Line and the Rhine River. They planned to do that with attacks in the north and south. In the south, the German position was weak. The Allies first encircled Metz, and after that they broke through the German lines and reached the Rhine. The Germans had to retreat. In the north, they pulled back to the Siegfried Line, where they stopped the Allies. In the south, they consolidated their forces in a smaller area to tie up more of the Allied forces. At the same time, they had also launched their attack in the north. They had already broken through the Siegfried Line and planned to cover the remaining land to the Rhine. The Germans were better prepared to defend against the northern attack. The Allies launched the attack in mid-November, but the progress was slow. The Germans sent reinforcements to the sector and denied any opportunity to make a breakthrough. By mid-December, the Allies had achieved only limited gains. The Germans knew that in order to avoid defeat, they needed to go on an offensive. Therefore, they decided to use their last limited forces to launch an attack on the Western Front. They were unable to gather an overwhelming force and instead hoped to catch the Allies off guard.
So, we've talked a lot about the great success of Allied intelligence throughout the war. We see that in the Pacific with places like Midway, the decisive intelligence coup that was in knowing exactly when and where the Japanese fleet was going to be and when they were going to attack and being able to surprise them. Here in the Western Front of Europe, we have the same thing with Normandy, where they have just incredible success in breaking the German code and knowing what the Germans are going to do and fooling them into thinking they knew what the Allies were going to do and being completely wrong. But here is a failure of intelligence. The Allies really missed the signs that should have showed them that the Germans were preparing a counteroffensive in the Ardennes. They completely missed it.
The Allies were attacking in the north and the south. Between them was an area which was known as the Ardennes, which was held weakly by the Allies. The Germans planned to pass through the Ardennes before the Allies could bring up reinforcements and then move to the sea and cut off a large part of Allied troops.
And so this is an important thing here. Remember how important it was, we talked in the episode the previous episode about how important the ports are, in particular ports like Antwerp. That's really kind of the main goal, is not only to cut off the Allied forces in the north and maybe encircle and destroy some of them, but to get that port back at Antwerp and deny that to the Allies and cause even greater supply issues than they've already been experiencing. Remember, none of this changes what's happening in the east, which is a complete collapse of the Eastern Front for the Germans.
The German attack was divided into the supporting offensive in the south and the main offensive in the north. In the main sector, only the southernmost attack could break through. The Allies then brought up their first reinforcements and halted the German breakthrough. The German northern attack had failed. In the south, the Germans broke through the Allied lines on a wide front. The Allies rushed in an airborne division to hold the important road junction of Bastogne. The Germans bypassed it and continued their advance. However, their advance had been too slow and the Allies began to arrive in force to the sector. The Germans consolidated their forces in the northern direction to continue the advance, but by that time, the Allies launched an attack from the south.
And, there's a couple things here. Most people, if you've studied World War II, you're familiar with the 101st Airborne's big defense of Bastogne. This is where they become a household name back home in America. The battered bastards of Bastogne, they called them. These guys hold out. They've got, they weren't expecting to be in combat. Most of their high command was out of the country. They're being led by their artillery commander, Anthony McAuliffe. Their commanding officer and a lot of their other top generals are not there. They don't have winter clothing. They don't have enough ammunition or supplies. They don't have air cover because the weather's bad. It's just pretty much as bad a situation as possible, and that's why it becomes so incredible that the 101st holds. And of course, the German commander sends them an ultimatum and says, hey, listen, save your troops from being destroyed, surrender, do the honorable thing. And McAuliffe responds with one word. It says to the German commander, nuts, in all capital letters. And somebody on his staff, the German commander, had to explain to him what that meant, which basically was screw you. And then, of course, famously, you have General Patton relieving the 101st Airborne from the south. And he was in the middle of an attack on the Siegfried line down in the south, and it was pretty brutal, and they were having a tough time getting through. And so it was this big feat of arms for them to disengage from an attack, move 100 miles north, and go right back into another attack. And there's this famous scene in the movie Patton. I don't know exactly how true it is, but they're going around the table asking, Eisenhower wants to know who can go relieve the 101st. And a couple of the other generals are like, oh, well, I can't do it. There's nothing I can do. And Patton says, I can be there with 3 divisions in 48 hours. And they're like, you want to give yourself a little space there on that? And he's like, no, my staff's already drawn up the plans. We can do it. And everybody else is surprised. They're like, I didn't know that your men would fight for you like that. And he said, well, they won't do it because they're fighting for me. They do it because they're good soldiers and they're trained well. And they did. And it was, it was an incredible feat by the 101st. It was an incredible feat by Patton's Third Army. And if you talk to veterans of the Western Front, American veterans at least, the ones that I had the opportunity to know over the years, if they weren't in the D-Day invasion of Normandy, almost all of them talk about the Battle of the Bulge. That's the one. If they were involved in the Battle of the Bulge, that was the big battle that everybody remembers being a part of and that everybody talked about. All my relatives who were in the war on the Western Front talked about the Battle of the Bulge if they talked about anything at all.
And re-established connection with Bastogne.
And I should mention, most people might know this, but if you don't, the reason they call it the Battle of the Bulge, you can see right there, because there's this bulge in the Allied line where they attacked.
To divert the Allies away from the Ardennes, the Germans launched an attack in the south. The Allies were now faced with the dangers of the Germans resuming the Ardennes offensive and with their southern attack. The offensive in the Ardennes was more dangerous for the Allies, and they concentrated their efforts there. They launched a 2-pronged attack against the German salient. The German units were threatened with encirclement and were forced to pull their forces back to a more secure location. With the Allied position in the Ardennes more secure, they could now send troops against the southern attack. At the same time, the Allies had been giving ground to the Germans, but the arrival of Allied reinforcements from the Ardennes helped to halt their advance.
And the main thing here at this point is going to be breaking the Siegfried line, crossing the Rhine. Once they're across the Rhine, it's just a matter of time.
Immediate danger taken care of, the Allies decided to secure their position in this sector by destroying the German pocket around Colmar.
Yeah, they call this the Colmar pocket. I think this is where Audie Murphy gets his Medal of Honor for just an incredible act of heroism in basically holding off an entire company of Germans by himself along with a bunch of tanks while sending his own company back to cover. That happened down in this area, I'm pretty sure.
So that the Germans could not use it for launching future attacks. The Germans did not have the strength to hold the pocket, and they were pushed over the Rhine.
Yeah, in fact, right there's the 3rd Infantry Division. That was the one that Audie Murphy was in.
That time, the Red Army had finished preparations and launched its main offensive in the east. The Red Army quickly advanced, encountering limited resistance. Soon their forces were coming near Berlin. With this new danger, the Eastern Front became the main priority for the Germans, and they moved.
And right at this point, this is right at about the time that you see that the Allies on both sides are basically at the borders of Germany. This is kind of the pre-war border of Germany. I mean, you had this little area here that had been given up to the Poles, so they had access to the sea. But that's basically where they are in January of 1945. And, it's just, everybody knows the war's over at this point.
Moved away some of their troops from the Western Front. The Germans now switched to full-on defensive in the west, and their forces retreated to the Siegfried Line. By that time, the Allies had built up their supplies and forces to launch a massive attack on the Western Front. They would capture the western bank of the Rhine first from the north, and then from the south. After that, they would cross the Rhine in 2 locations and then capture the Ruhr, which housed large parts of German war industry. The Germans were strongly outnumbered, but they were ordered to avoid retreat and hold their positions. The Allies started their northern attack in early February. In the south, the Germans made use of rough terrain and were able to contain the Allied advance. In the center, the Germans had opened the dams on the Ruhr River, creating a temporary flood which prevented the Allies from crossing it.
At this point, when you know you're losing, it's over, you'll do whatever you have to slow things down. Opening up dams, throwing up whatever obstacles you can, destroying bridges. You're doing all of that stuff to try and slow the advance.
The central part of the front quiet, they were able to gather enough forces to contain the Allied advance in the north. But then the water levels in the Ruhr dropped, and the Allies crossed the river. The Germans were unable to hold them off, and were pushed back, suffering large casualties. They retreated over the Rhine, destroying the bridges behind them. The Allies then turned south, the German lines collapsed, and they lost half of their strength as prisoners. In the chaos, the Allies were able to capture an intact bridge over the Rhine at Remagen. They established a bridgehead over the river.
And that was a big, big deal. And look at the date. You're talking about March. You're talking about 2 months before the end of the war. The Allies are just now about to get into Germany for the first time in the west.
The Allies moved in to capture the last German-controlled area west of Rhine. The Germans were somewhat able to contain the Allied attack from the south, but in the north, the Allies advanced through the German lines with little opposition. The Germans began a belated retreat, but a lot of their soldiers were taken prisoner. In the confusion, the Allies were able to cross the Rhine in several places. By that time, the Allies had finished their preparations for the northern Rhine crossing. The Germans were unable to resist it, and the Allies established themselves on the east shore. The German decision not to allow retreat over the Rhine had proven to be disastrous. They had lost 300,000 men as prisoners alone and were now unable to defend the Rhine River defenses.
And think about that. They had 1 million men to start when they got to this line. So they've lost 1/3 of them as prisoners, not to mention all the ones that are being killed or wounded.
The Allies now set out to neutralize the German war industry in the Ruhr. The Allies moved east, which made the Germans overextend their defenses. The Allies then turned north and outflanked them.
And this is a constant strategy. You see this throughout the war. If you notice that every single time, it's not about pushing the entire front forward all at once, because that's not a very efficient way to do things. You try and find weak spots. You probe for those weak spots. You push through. And when you break through in that spot, then you start to encircle. And that causes everybody else to pull back to try and keep from becoming encircled themselves. The exact same thing's happening on the Eastern Front.
Same time, they broke out of the northern bridgehead. And soon, both of the Allied forces linked up and encircled the Germans in the Ruhr. Most of the German forces in the area had been caught in the pocket, and the way into Germany was open. The Allies advanced east. Large areas of Germany fell to the Allies with little opposition. The Germans still had significant forces around Berlin. Part of them were sent to block the Allied advance, but they were too few and were encircled and destroyed.
And there's a chance during all of this that the Western Allies could have probably gotten to Berlin, but a decision was made at some point by the Western leadership that they were going to go ahead and let the Soviets take Berlin. I don't know the details into why or how that decision was made, but I know that was a decision they made at some point. So they didn't really focus that heavily on rushing to get to Berlin first, and that was disappointing for a lot of the troops on the ground.
The Allies established a defensive line along the Elbe River. Then the Germans had to concentrate on repelling the Raid Army's attack on Berlin. By that time, the German resistance on the Western Front was collapsing, but they still had strong forces on other fronts, and there was the danger that the Germans could pull their forces into the Alps and make a final stand. The Allies turned south in order to reach the Alps before the Germans could set up strong defensive positions there. However,
the last thing you want is a guerrilla war in the mountains that goes on for years. And remember, Bavaria, which is in the south of Germany, is this is kind of the birthplace of National Socialism. It's where Hitler has his eagle's nest, Berchtesgaden. It's that town that is made up of all Nazis, so this is this is what they were afraid of, and so it's more of a priority to get there and make sure that doesn't turn into a guerrilla war than it is to beat the Soviets into Berlin.
In reality, the Germans had no intentions in making a final stand in the mountains, and after the fall of Berlin had removed Hitler from power, their new government surrendered unconditionally in early May.
All right, so that was pretty cool. Gives you a little bit of an overview. One of the things I love about how he does this is that he's showing all the individual divisions. And so if you're ever curious about, where was the 45th Division when all this was happening? Where was the 11th Armored Division while all this was happening? You could see that on his maps, which I think are really well done, and that's a ton of research. That's not something you can just pull up a couple maps and throw together. I mean, there has to have been a ton of research that was done to do this, so I commend him for that, and I highly encourage you to check out his other videos and support that channel. Give him a subscription if you are interested in doing so. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below about everything we talked about today. We do have an ongoing vote happening over on Patreon. It seems like there's a pretty clear winner, and so we will come back with episode 1 of that new series. It might not even be a series. It might just be a one-off video, depending on what won the vote. But we'll be back with that choice tomorrow. Thanks for watching.